Tonight we're going to talk about one of the so-called immortals of Marshal Davout's corps. We're going to talk about Louis Friant or Louis Friant. What is your kind of sketch of this man?
So Louis Friant was of course, a general in the French and Napoleonic armies, born in 1758. Um, I won't call him a plotter, but he's left over from that. He had service in the French army before the Revolution and was an incredibly capable tactician and leader, both on the field and off the field, and also had the good sense, if you want to call it that, or good luck, to marry into Davout's family. And so that, in a sense, helped his career tremendously. Although, honestly, he doesn't need it. He's an incredibly gifted officer.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that marrying into a marshal of France's family because Napoleon's the rising star, but these all these other rising stars, the marshals, Napoleon's family. So if you can get in that solar system, it's usually pretty good for your career.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Listeners of your show will know that the importance of the family is incredibly important to Napoleon,
Mm.
such that, certainly promotion in the early part of the empire, during the revolution, early part of the empire, was based entirely on merit. And those lines get a little fuzzy towards the end of the empire, where family is promoted. I don't think anyone could say with a straight face that Jerome was the most capable person that could have run the kingdom of Westphalia, and yet he's promoted to be a king.
Yeah.
So those familial relations, those relations with the Bonaparte family, and so Friant gets into it through the Leclerc side, which also had married into the Bonaparte family. So tangentially, Davout is part of the inner circle, not just because of his accomplishments, but because also his marital relations.
Correct. And we'll dive into the Marshall and the families and all that kind of stuff here in a minute. But let's talk about Friant's upbringing. As you mentioned, he was born September 1758 in the
Yep.
village of Morlancourt. What do we know of his upbringing?
Well, he comes from what today we would call a middle class background. His father was a candle maker, uh, reasonably well off, and it was hoped that Louis would go into the candle making business, as one does. But Louis had designs in other ways. He wanted the exciting life of the army, so he joins the Royal Army in the years before the Revolution.
Okay.
And 1781 or so, he joins. He does 6 or so years of service there, rises to the incredibly high rank of corporal, and then after 6 years, bails on the military, probably because the prospects for promotion for someone who does not have a noble background just were not that great.
You know, it's interesting. Like for every marshal, like Davout came from a military family. There's like a general like Friant or Murat, the son of an innkeeper, or Lon, the son of a dyer, like who maybe their parents didn't have the most exciting job. Like Friant's dad was a wax and candle making businessman. So maybe not having an exciting job lent itself to for these young men to look for other options, including the military.
Sure, Sewell's family were bakers. Nay's family comes from Coopers, barrel makers. So yeah,
Yeah.
maybe that's just not what some young men are looking for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you mentioned, in 1789, he comes back to the military after leaving as a corporal. And he joins the Parisian National Guard during the French Revolution, and a few years later is elected to lieutenant colonel. So that's a pretty rapid rise. Does he see any action?
Yeah, he's engaged quite heavily from, of course, when the war breaks out in spring of 1792, really until 1794 or 95 in the Benelux area, modern day Belgium. He's at Fleurus, for instance, and he's constantly engaged in action, wounded multiple times, not grievously, but wounded. So he's on the front, taking fire, involved in leading his men from the front, as a lot of these distinguished generals of division and future marshals are going to have that experience.
Indeed, yeah. Well, in 1794, he takes part in the Great Victory of Fleurus, which is a notable victory over the Austrians, and I believe it is the first battle to use aerial observation and recon in the form of a balloon.
Yeah.
And the future Marshal Soult also said the battle, quote, was 15 hours of the most desperate fighting I've ever saw in my life, end quote. So it sounds like Friant's learning on the job, right?
Oh, absolutely. And there are lots of engagements where Friant is involved, not just big set piece battles like Fleur, but also little skirmishes and actions all along the way. So he's right up there in it.
Okay. Well, in 1795, he finally gets the promotion to big general, general of brigade, and served as chief of staff to General Scherer. And then in 1797, he joins Bernadotte's division in Italy. Is this where he first met Napoleon Bonaparte?
We don't have any. I'm not aware of any records that they met in 1797. It would be impossible to think that they didn't at least make each other's acquaintance. Where they're most likely to have spent a lot more time together or got to know each other better would have been on the expedition to Egypt, which comes in a few years later.
Right. Yeah. And Friant joins the Napoleon's expedition to Egypt and serves under the talented General Desai and a future boss named Davout, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And Desai and Davout are best buds, so it would not be surprising that Friant would get exposed to and introduced to, socialized with Davout during that time.
Okay. Well, in 1799, Friant is promoted to general of division. So again, he's rapidly rising up the ranks. Do we know how he performed in the Egyptian campaign? I know it was a brutal campaign for all of Napoleon's soldiers.
Yeah, although he took a less publicized route, Desai, of course, was sent to Upper Egypt, which a little counterintuitively is south along the Nile. So he misses, for instance, Napoleon's invasion of the Holy Land. He misses all that because he's seeing quite a bit of action down the Nile along with Desai and Davout.
Okay. Well, he unfortunately is not one of the lucky few who escapes with Napoleon to France. Napoleon's replacement, Kléber, is killed shortly thereafter by an assassin, and Friant becomes second in command to General Manot, who commanded all French forces in Egypt. So, I mean, that's a pretty lofty position for Friant. So he must have had some talent as an organizer.
Yeah, absolutely. And he served well, like I said, in the upper Egypt campaign. And I think he distinguished himself there and then became Manu's second in command. So he's evacuated with the troops once there's finally an agreement with the British who effectively take over Egypt in 1801.
Okay. Was repatriated back to France after the surrender to the British, and a few years later marries the sister of General Leclerc, which makes him brother-in-law to his future boss, Marshal Davout. What do we know about his personal life?
We know that marriage was probably, I don't know, one of the signature moments in his life in terms of just good fortune. Or good planning. Oftentimes it might be good for your readers to remember that the concept of marrying for love is a relatively new one. Usually, marriages were put together to unite the interests of separate families, things and such. Although they could marry for love, it happened.
Yep.
So it turned out to be a fortuitous development for Friant.
Yeah, you look at some of the marriages. I know Napoleon's brother Louis's marriage to Josephine's daughter Hortense was not love at all, and nor was love found in there. But then you look at Prince Eugene's marriage. I think it was to the daughter of was it Bavaria or one of the allies of Napoleon?
Right. Yep.
And that turned into love. That turned into a love story.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, our good friend Rachel details with great clarity the relationships between the marshals and their spouses. And there were some there were some great marriages, and then there were some ones that were not so great. And then, in one particular case, General Junot married a woman who wrote all kinds of scandalous memoirs, and that was a tumultuous relationship, to say the least.
I like that you shoehorned a Juno reference there. That's good.
Hey,
That's
man,
good.
I got wherever I can, right?
I know that's your guy. Getting back to Friant, in 1805, he takes command of the 2nd Division of Davout's famed 3rd Corps. And Davout's division earns a reputation for rapid marching, notably moving 70 miles in 46 hours to arrive just in time to secure the right flank of Napoleon's army at the victorious Battle of Austerlitz. I just want to pause here for a minute to point out what a feat of arms that is in December in the middle of the night, right?
Yeah, and I've seen the reference to 46 hours. I think it was closer to 36 hours. I think there might be a typo in some of the sources there. But let's conceive that a different way. That's 2.5 marathons, 36 hours.
Right.
That's just ridiculous. Once they got to the destination, Elting points out that there were probably only, out of 20 men, only one of them arrived, on time.
Right.
The stragglers, the line of stragglers was impressive. But nevertheless, Davout had planned for this and had officers placed and, was able to wrangle the stragglers. And as we all know, the Third Corps made a fantastic show of itself on the southern French right flank at Austerlitz. And Napoleon really gambled. Your listeners will be well aware on Davout holding that flank so that he could make his assault on the Pratzen.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to reference it or make it a modern times analogy. Imagine running 2 marathons and then fighting a battle at the end of it.
2.5 marathons.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have any bumper stickers on my car. If I ever put a bumper sticker on my car, it would say 0.0.
Yeah.
So I am not going to run a marathon, and these guys are doing 2.5 marathons. Now, I mean, they're seasoned, and this speaks to, and Friant was of the same camp at Davout here. They drill these guys, I don't want to say remorselessly. Let's just call it thoroughly. Right. So, I mean, they march. They're primed for this. They're in physical condition for this. But then one of the things that Davout and Friant did very well was to see to the physical needs of their soldiers. So they have the proper clothing. They have boots that are in good order. And it makes all of these incredible feats of physical stamina and strength all the more possible and doable.
That's a good point. Well, during the ferocity of the Austerlitz fighting, Friant has 3 horses shot out from under him. This later becomes his coat of arms when he's ennobled by Napoleon. He's also becomes one of the 3 Immortals of Davout. Why were they named that?
Well, the first of all, I think the consistency. So the 3 leaders of which you speak are General Gudin, Friant, who we're talking about, and General Morand. And they were Davout's 3 divisional commanders, really up until the Russian campaign. So we're talking about a span of 6 years, or a little bit longer than 6 years. Yeah. That's incredibly consistent. And these guys, share Davout's commitment to drill and commitment to looking after the personal concerns and personal welfare of the soldiers. That made that corps unique. It made it special. There were some who mentioned that that Davout's corps, the condition of those soldiers rivaled that of the Imperial Guard. So, and then of course, then they could walk and march with a bit of swagger. And a French army of the Napoleonic era marching with swagger. You think that ever happened? Of course it did. And, there was definitely some pride in that.
I think you hit on something, though. Davout's Third Corps, Ney's Sixth Corps, the Imperial Guard, they all had usually the same commanders and the same kind of divisional commanders. And when you have that uniformity over multiple years, instead of changing commanders willy-nilly, you have consistency like the Pittsburgh Steelers or any organization that's had like 3 coaches in its existence, where you have that consistency. You know what to expect from the commanders.
Absolutely. And it helps that if the commanders are in alignment with the corps commander. Now, that won't always be the case with Davout, but we can talk about that a little bit later on.
Okay. Well, in 1806, Davout's corps has arguably its finest moment at the Battle of Auerstedt. And without us going too down into the rabbit hole, can you tell us what happens there?
Sure. Your listeners will recall that it's really a twin battle of Jena, Auerstadt. So at Jena, Napoleon encounters what he thinks is the largest portion of the Prussian army. It turns out not to be the largest portion. The largest portion is a little bit further north and east. And he had sent both Davout's corps and Bernadotte's corps around to cut off what he imagined would be the retreat of the Prussian army. So Davout corps runs into the largest chunk of the Prussian army, and he only has Gudin's division initially when he makes initial contact. So Gudin just hunkers down, puts the guys in square because Blucher has so much cavalry around there, and so by 9 o'clock, Gudin is hotly engaged. By 9:30, though, Friant has hustled up, and Davout directs him to Gudin's right flank and starts to put pressure on the Prussian left flank. And with Friant came the heavy artillery, so that they start to stabilize the position a little bit. Through just a bit of bad luck, the Prussian commander Brunswick gets hit by a stray bullet and is killed on the spot. And the Prussian king does not take command of the battle, so the Prussian army is left without effective leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever attacks they make with their overwhelming numbers are piecemeal and poorly directed. So by the time that Davout's last divisional, Morand, comes onto the field and assumes a position to the left of Gudin, then everything's in place. And by 11 o'clock, Davout is ordered a general assault and sweeps the broken Prussian army off the field.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, initially he was outnumbered 3-1, and even towards the end, he was still outnumbered 2-1, and he attacked the larger army and won. So it's amazing.
Well, and that's one of the gifts that the best of these Napoleonic generals have on either side, is they can sense when the enemy in general is starting to waver. And by 11 o'clock, the Prussian attacks have been spent largely through ineffective cavalry on squares. Rarely is that going to work, except in the peninsula. And the Prussian army is just exhausted and in shambles. And they had started to hear rumors or reports from the remnants of the Prussian army at Jena that they had gotten decimated.
Right.
So Prussian morale is plummeting, and Davout, senses that, uses his spidey senses, and orders the general assault, and the whole Prussian army collapses.
Yeah, no, I know it's one of Marshal Davout's most famous victories, and Napoleon gives him and his troops the honor of being the first to enter Berlin.
Absolutely. Famous quote there, famous story of Napoleon when Davout reports back the numbers he's engaged and defeated. Napoleon says, your marshal must be seeing double, referring to the fact that Davout had some significant vision problems, so had a set of impressive eyeglasses on, thinking that he's not seeing the numbers that he's seeing.
Right.
And Napoleon could be very petty, and I'll give it up to Napoleon in this case. He does give Davout credit for Auerstedt, ennobles him with that title, does not try and downplay it, which is notable.
I think that is a good example of him sharing credit. Now, Jena was his battle, but he could have easily just said, "Oh, well, Jena Auerstedt was my total victory," but he shared that with
as he did in many other places. Yeah,
indeed. Well, in 1807, Friant fights at the bloody stalemate of Eylau and is wounded. Napoleon makes him Count of the Empire, and he also fights throughout the 1809 campaigns. Do you think Napoleon ever considered making him a marshal?
That's a great question. And, of course, I don't have any evidence for it. I know that he was, before the Russian campaign, which I know we're about to talk about, he was offered a position in the Guard and elected to stay with Davout. And so I think that, obviously the familial ties there probably played a role in that. Pretty great personal loyalty to turn down command in the Guard.
Right.
To stay with Davout. So Friant seems pretty tied to Davout at that point.
Okay. Well, as you mentioned, in 1812, he joins Napoleon's invasion of Russia and is wounded again at the Battle of Smolensk. Then he's more severely wounded at the Battle of Borodino. And I read this. I knew they left some wounded people there, but is this true? He was left there to heal because he was so incapacitated, like literally left on the battlefield?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, when the army starts to retreat from Moscow in October, he's literally still there. So
yeah,
at least they get him out before the worst of it. Napoleon tried to go south. The Russians blocked him. So they have to go back over the same ground from which they entered. But Friant is at least evacuated before the general retreat starts. So he doesn't suffer through the horrible winter retreat like the survivors of the Grande Armée did.
Well, it's probably a good thing. Napoleon needed fighting generals when he got back to France.
Yeah, absolutely. So he sent back and really is recuperating, ended 1812, beginning of 1813 from pretty serious wounds. And it should be noted that at Borodino, where Davout's corps was heavily involved fighting around the Fletches, the famous wooden fortifications that the Russians hastily erected, these are not guys that are commanding from the rear.
No, and I forget who I was reading, if it was Colin Core or somebody. I witnessed Davout, and he took a hit and fell from his horse so hard that they thought Marshal Davout was dead because it was such a heavy hit. So yeah, a lot of guys got wounded at Borodino. It was really unfortunate.
Yep, absolutely. And there was a little bit of momentary panic there when Davout went down at Borodino because they were afraid that he got lost. And
Yeah.
we don't have to look far to know how devastating that could be. Bagration went
Yeah.
down in the same area, and that was a factor that led to demoralizing to the extent that it did the Russian army.
That's a great point. You mentioned it during the Auerstädt. Like when an army loses their commander in any fashion, it can be the morale can just plummet. Well, in 1813, Friant is commanding the Imperial Guard and fights at Dresden, Leipzig, and Hanau. He also fights well in the 1814 invasion of France. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I might just take a tiny diversion here to explain why he's no longer with Davout or why he doesn't go back into service with Davout. Davout, at the conclusion of the Russian invasion, is sent to command the French presence at Hamburg. And so essentially Davout has a garrison. He doesn't have a mobile force anymore. Davout has the garrison at Hamburg.
Mhm.
And some notable trivia on that. He is the only officer of those senior officers that was not allowed to go back in 1812 and 1813 to France to recuperate. He was literally reassigned to Hamburg and sent there. One of the sources I read said to punish the Germans for not being French enough. But
Yeah,
Friant is not needed in Hamburg because it's a garrison situation. So he
interesting.
does at that point get to take the command of the guard. And he fights throughout the end of 1813 and into 1814, fights from the front, fights well, gets wounded a couple more times. I mean,
Yeah,
we're not talking Boudinot level wounds, but he's dinged up.
yeah. Well, upon Napoleon's abdication in 1814, Friant serves under the Bourbons, but joins Napoleon again for the Hundred Days campaign, and is again commanding the Imperial Guard. Performs well at the Battle of Ligny. What happens at Waterloo? Because you read the final charge of the Imperial Guard. First, it's Napoleon leading them. Then it's Ney. Then it's Friant as they get closer and closer. So, what happens here?
So Friant is the commander on the field, so he's the one making the tactical decisions literally on the field. But as we know, in a situation like that, I think it was Mike Tyson who said most famously, "No battle plan suffers the first punch." There's so much at Waterloo. There's so much smoke, fog, confusion, noise. It's impossible to actively coordinate. But it's not Ney or Napoleon that's leading that. It's Friant.
Yeah. Yeah, we know what happens there. The French lose, and Napoleon has to abdicate a second time. What were Friant's later years like, and what do you think his legacy is?
Well, he doesn't live too terribly long after that. He dies in the 1820s, and of course he's drummed out of the military, as most of these guys were. He does get his rank and things restored in 1820 when the rest of the Napoleonic folks do. But after Waterloo, he just retires to a quiet life of retirement, and he takes no more active role in the military or in politics or anything.
Yeah, no, he had a very long career. So I guess his legacy, is being part of the Three Immortals, being part of Davout's famed Third Corps, but just a sturdy, reliable general for Napoleon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would go beyond sturdy and reliable. I mean, I cannot imagine. I could say definitively, I can't think of a better general of division than, frankly, any of these guys, but particularly Friant.
Yeah, and there's a lot out there, Saint Hilaire and some other guys that were very good divisional commanders who didn't get all the way to Marshal, but who were really good divisional commanders.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Charles, for joining us once again. If you want to find Charles, you can catch up with him on Blue Sky, Bubbles Vampire. And we thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. Have me back anytime.